From the KPFK studios in Southern California,
it's the Ralph Nader Radio Hour.
Stand up, you've been sitting way too long.
Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. My name is Steve Scrovan. David Feldman is on vacation. He's in Poland, Maine, where I imagine his hair is getting nice and fluffy from all that Poland spring water. But we do have the man who never takes a vacation, the man of the hour, Ralph Nader. Hello, Ralph.
Hi. Hello, everybody.
We have another provocative show for you today, jam-packed with important information. On the program today, we will be joined once again by Israeli activist Miko Peled. Regular listeners may remember we first talked to Mr. Peled about a year and a half ago. We talked to him about his autobiography, The General's Son. In that program, Mr. Peled argued that a two-state solution is no longer viable because Israel is simply not interested and apparently unwilling under any circumstances to compromise on the issue of the land. Well, he has a new book out now entitled Injustice, The Story of the Holy Land Foundation 5, which is a deep dive investigation into the trial of 5 Palestinian American families from Texas and California. Their charity, called the Holy Land Foundation for Relief and Development, was accused of aiding Hamas, which is considered by the United States to be a foreign terrorist organization. They were first arrested back in 2004. They were eventually convicted, but the key witness against them was an anonymous Israeli intelligence agent. Contrary to the Constitution, the accused in this case were unable to face or cross-examine their accuser. So we look forward to finding out how all of that was rationalized. Also, we will welcome back old friend Robert Weissman, the president of Public Citizen. Public Citizen has recently released 2 scathing reports. One is entitled Corporate Impunity. Now, while the Trump administration talks about being tough on crime, which I guess for him means separating immigrant children from their parents, they have a rather light touch, not surprisingly, when it comes to corporate white-collar crime. And the second report released just this week is an in-depth analysis of the judicial decisions and philosophy of Supreme Court nominee Brett Kavanaugh. Without giving too much away, the report reveals that as a lower court judge, Kavanaugh has voted for corporate interests and against the public interest 87% of the time. And along those same lines, we'll check in, as always, with our corporate crime reporter, Russell Mokhiber. And if we have time, we'll try to knock out some listener questions. But first, let's talk about what looks to be a miscarriage of criminal justice. Miko Peled is an Israeli writer and activist living in the United States. He writes a blog dedicated to tearing down the wall between Israelis and Palestinians so that they can live as equal citizens. Mr. Peled was born and raised in Jerusalem. His grandfather was a signer of the Israeli Declaration of Independence, and his father was a general in the 1967 war. His latest work is entitled Injustice, The Story of the Holy Land Foundation 5. Welcome back to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, Miko Peled.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be with you again.
Yes, indeed. Welcome back. This is one of the great miscarriages of justice, which has been relegated to the obscure corners of modern American history. And then to bring it down to the human level, I'm just going to quote Miko Peled, the first paragraph of your book in your introduction. Quote, at precisely 7 a.m. Central Time on July 27, 2004, the homes of Shukri Abu Bakr, Ghassan Ilashi, Mufid Abdelkader, Abdurrahman Odeh, and Mohammed El Mazain were raided by local and federal law enforcement. All 5 men, who would come to be known as the HLF-5, were taken into custody 4 years and 2 trials later. All 5 were sent to federal prison, serving sentences ranging from 15 to 65 years, end quote. What's this about 2 trials? I thought you lose the first trial under American criminal law, and they can't bring a second based on the double jeopardy clause.
Yeah, Ralph, the things that were allowed to happen in this trial and that were unconstitutional and unprecedented and unheard of before this trial, the book is full of them, and the story is full of these unprecedented and unconstitutional things that took place. It's really quite beyond belief. Not only that, but at the end of the first trial, which ended up with no convictions, it was a hung jury. One of the five, Mufid Abdelkader, was found not guilty on all charges. There were 32 charges, and the judge read not guilty 32 times. But when the jury was polled by the prosecution, suddenly one of the jurors stood up and she said, no, I didn't mean that. And even though the foreman showed that they all signed off on it, and even though the defense team, protested, the judge allowed it and called a mistrial on him too. And now he's serving 20 years in federal prison. It's hard to believe that these things take place, these and other things that took place in this trial, take place in a court of law here in the United States. And of course, people have no idea.
This trial, which took place in Texas, got very little national attention by the press that often covers high-profile trials. But in this book, Injustice, Miko Peled, you really went into the details. Not only 20,000 pages of trial record, you went into the details of the life of these immigrants who came from Palestine. Why don't you describe what they came for and what they did and what their families are like?
Sure. Well, these are all five men, all their, their lives, like most Palestinians, were directly affected, or I should say most Palestinians of that generation were directly affected by the occupation of their land, by the violence that has taken over their land, by the fact that they had no choice and they were not able to live there anymore. They were refugees. And eventually they all made their way into, to the United States, remained here, started families, started businesses, had a life, were part of the community, of the larger Arab, Palestinian, Muslim community, and decided it was time to give. And each particular one in his own particular way contributed to the Holy Land Foundation and used that as a means not only to help to further their own desire to help their people, but also be a vehicle for other Palestinians and other Muslims who wanted to support Palestine, but really had no way to do so. So they put together this relief organization, and it was a clean operation, an honest operation, they were mostly volunteers. I think they worked on like 91 cents to the dollar went straight to charity, which is really quite remarkable for relief organizations.
Charity in Palestine.
For charity mostly in Palestine, but they provided relief around the world when there were either man-made disasters or issues of refugees or natural disasters, tornadoes, earthquakes, floods here in the U.S. and overseas. So they were there wherever they were needed, but their focus was definitely Palestine and the Palestinian people. That was their main focus.
And wasn't it true that the U.S. government, before 9/11, cooperated with them in some ways?
Oh, absolutely. They worked with the USAID, they worked with the Red Cross, they worked with the United Nations, they worked with everybody. Everybody collaborated with them because they had a stellar reputation. They had the highest ratings from every time they were rated as a relief organization. They got the highest rating. Their taxes were always filed on time. Their papers were in the, every time they were audited and they were found to be completely legit and completely honest and above board. And they did a remarkable job, which is precisely what, in the end, caused their fall. This is precisely why they had to be brought down, because they were presenting a very positive image of Palestinians, because they were Palestinians, of a Palestinian organization, that's how they were considered.
Well,
They were the largest Muslim charity organization in the U.S., and they were presenting the Palestinian people, in a light that people were not, that was problematic for a lot of people.
And here's what started the process. You remember after 9/11, George Bush said on more than one occasion, there were these al-Qaeda cells all over the country, sleeper cells, in order to aggregate even more power in the White House to do something allegedly about it. And when the press said, well, where are these cells? Oh, of course, he pulled the Trump. It was like fake news. But he had to do something. So on December 4th, 2001, the Holy Land Foundation was shut down by President George W. Bush under Executive Order 13224. And as you say in your book, quote, federal agents raided the charity's offices and seized all documents, assets, and funds of the organization, as well as personal property of the employees, end quote. Whatever happened to due process?
There was no due process. There was a sense that now we can do whatever we want. And there's a description in Paul O'Neill's biography, the sense of, he's the Treasury Secretary, the sense of we got to do stuff and we got to be able to do all the stuff without having to go through due process, because we need to move fast and we don't want to have to worry about due process and legalities, those rights and so forth. So they created an environment where this could happen, and the president wanted something that he could announce. And the way they describe it is, well, let's just round up the usual suspects. And the Holy Land Foundation was at the top of the list of the usual suspects because they were Muslims, they were Palestinians, they were involved in charity, so they were sending money to Palestine. So it was kind of the perfect. It was a picture perfect, suspect, if you will. And they closed them down and seized their assets. But what's interesting is their response to this was perfectly calm. They completely understood that the United States was panicking. They perfectly understood that the government felt they had to do something, and they perfectly understood why they were targeted. But they said, we did everything right. We have all the proof in the world that we did everything right. We're going to sue the government. We're going to utilize the means that this country has provided for us as citizens, and everything is going to be fine. So, of course, they sued the government expecting that everything would be fine. And the judge threw out the case, and all the evidence that they presented, the judge threw out as well. So they were in this new reality where being a Muslim and being a Palestinian meant that your evidence and your case, even if it's a solid one, is not going to matter because you're a Muslim and a Palestinian, and that's what comes first. So she threw out the evidence, she threw out the case, and they were just left like that with no explanation.
By the way, who represented him? What lawyers represented him? And was it mostly pro bono?
They had a team of lawyers. I mentioned all of them in the book: Nancy Hollander, John Boyd, John Klein, a few others. These are stellar human rights lawyers, veteran human rights lawyers that have been doing this work for a very long time. They were paid some of the money that was left, and they were paid by, there's an organization called the Muslim Legal Fund of America, MLFA, and they picked up some of the bill as well.
In your book, Miko Peled, we're talking with Miko Peled, the author of the book Injustice on the prosecution of the Holy Land Foundation 5. Your book says at the beginning, quote, the prosecution's theory was that by supporting needy Palestinians, the Holy Land Foundation had, quote, freed up, quote, Hamas's own assets to fund terrorist attacks, and that if Palestinians knew that Holy Land Foundation would provide support for their families if assistance became necessary, they'd be more likely to become suicide bombers, end quote. Boy, that's a pretty lengthy sequence here. On that basis, the U.S. aid to the Israeli occupation and all the innocent civilians in the thousands whose lives were lost by Israeli attacks in the West Bank and Gaza, the occupied West Bank and Gaza, a illegal occupation under international law, would be prosecutable as well. Is that the reason why in the second trial they brought in secret evidence? It seemed like in the second trial there was what the Texans used to call a hanging judge who just was very biased against the defendant, 5. Can you explain that?
It gets worse. It gets worse when you listen to some of the testimony by experts, and they had these PhDs, people like Matt Levine from DC, people who sit on think tanks and advise the president. These are terrorism experts, and what they were saying was that it's well known that if somebody knows that their family will be taken care of, then they are likely to volunteer to become a suicide bomber and a terrorist. In other words, any one of us, if we knew that our kids were going to get $50, $100 a month stipend, we would volunteer to become terrorists. I mean, that's the reasoning. So not only were they supporting terrorism, they were encouraging terrorism because they had an orphans program and they were providing some funds and some relief, mostly in kind though, very little money, but mostly in kind. But still, they're providing relief to orphans. So the rationale was so absolutely insane that you wonder how people didn't just stand up and laugh. So it means that, if you and I knew that our kids were going to get $50 a month, we would volunteer to become, terrorists immediately, wouldn't we? That is the rationale. And the truth is these were two intelligence people that came from Israel that testified anonymously. They came in the first trial and they came in the second trial. In the second trial, they did have a hanging judge. The second trial allowed, the first trial was no friend of the defense for sure. And I show that in the book, quite clearly. The second judge, I think, knew he had to convict. So he allowed evidence and he allowed testimony that even the first judge did not allow. And when they went to appeal, the appellate court said, well, there was no reason to accept the appeal because what happened in the second trial was harmless. And so they said, but wait a minute, there were certain aspects in the second trial, certain things that the judge allowed that the first judge did not allow. The first trial ended with no convictions. The second one ended with all convictions. How can you say it was harmless?
Just to broaden the context, Miko Peled, throughout American history, there have been immigrant charities. For example, Irish American charities sent to Ireland in the time of the IRA and the attacks and fight against the British in Northern Ireland. And they were never prosecuted, saying that their money that sent to poor people in Ireland was going to free up resources for the IRA. And all kinds of immigrant groups to Eastern Europe and elsewhere could have been prosecuted, but they were not prosecuted. It sort of illustrates the unique bias and Islamophobia that surrounded the case that your book, Injustice, has recounted in such detail. But the idea of anonymous secret witnesses in an open trial in Texas is really irregular to the extreme. And that is, of course, what probably tipped the balance in terms of the jury. But let's put their names on the table here. What was the name of the prosecutor? What was the name of the judge?
Well, Jim Jacks was the head prosecutor. The second judge was the first judge was Joe Fish. The second judge was Jorge Solis.
Okay. Now, were their decisions appealed?
Yes. Well, the second judge, of course, they went to appeal, and like I said, they showed that what the second judge allowed was unconstitutional and should never have been allowed. But the appellate court said it was harmless and therefore it was okay. And when they came back and they showed that it wasn't harmless, that the second judge allowed all this information and all this testimony and actually got all convictions, so it wasn't harmless. But the appellate court just did not come back with a reply, and that was the end of it. And the Supreme Court wouldn't hear the case, and President Obama was petitioned, but he refused to commute the sentences, even though there was a campaign and there were several countries that were happy to accept them as citizens if they could. He commuted the sentence and deported them, but he refused to do that.
Did this case start in federal or state court?
No, this is a federal case all along.
So it went up to the Circuit Court of Appeals, and then the Supreme Court denied cert?
Yeah.
And so they're left with prison sentences up to 65 years. Could you describe the five defendants, what their lives are like now, where they are, what prisons they are? Can they be visited by their family? Because I know you visited them all. You went back to Palestine. You met with their relatives and families. This is an extremely meticulous book. Could you describe what's their feeling? What's their attitude? Are they resentful? Are they angry? Tell us about these five people and give us their names.
So, these are the most remarkable people I've ever met in my life. And I'm not exaggerating one bit. Shukri Abu Bakr is the first one I was in touch with. He was the CEO, and he was one of two who received 65 years. And he is in Beaumont, in Port Arthur, Texas, in a maximum security prison. It's a terribly dangerous prison, incredibly dangerous prison. I visited him several times. We've become good friends. He's had some incredibly tough times. His daughter, one of his daughters, who was very, very sick, passed away. She was 26 years old. She passed away while he was in prison. He was not allowed to visit her. He was not allowed to see her. It is possible to visit, but the visitation is an enormously complicated process. First of all, it's far from where the family lives. Originally, they were closer by to where the family lives, but then the prosecution demanded that they be sent to all these other prisons. And I should say that actually the first couple of years, after 18 months of being in Texas, not far from their families, they were sent to CMUs, communication management units, which are Guantanamo-like prisons, one in Indiana and one in Illinois. And so they were there for a few years. After that, they were released to the regular prison, what they call general population, and they were spread around the country. So the first time I met Shukri was once he was in the regular prison in Beaumont, Port Arthur. And the process of visitation is so humiliating and so heartbreaking that it's really people have to see it to believe it. And the families do go, but there are limitations. There are certain days that you can visit, certain hours that you can visit. But you can imagine a large family traveling, flying, renting a car, hotels. It's an extremely, extremely expensive and difficult journey. And quite often they will arrive and they will not be allowed in, or or the prison will be closed down because of a lockdown, because something happened in the prison. It's a very, very difficult process. And it was heartbreaking for me, and I'm not a family member. And it was heartbreaking for me. So that's Shukri, and he's in Port Arthur. The second gentleman who received 65 years is Ghassan Ilashi. His daughter Noor was very active for several years trying to help him. I was not permitted to visit him for reasons that I never I have no idea why. They're puzzling. I applied many, many times. He's moved to several prisons, and every single time my application was denied. Mufid Abdul Qadir, he's the one who was found not guilty at the end of the first trial, and then he got 20 years. The only reason he was even involved in any of this, because he was just a volunteer, he really had nothing to do with the running of the organization. The only reason he was roped in was because his brother is Khalid Mash'al, and Khalid Mash'al used to be the head of the political bureau of Hamas for many, many years. Of course, he hadn't seen him in 3 decades, and they live on 2 different continents. But this was brought up many, many, many times, that who his brother is, and how important family connections are in terrorist organizations. This was a point that was made by the prosecution. And I visited him. He's moved around also several times. I visited him in several prisons. Now he's in Seagoville, Texas. Let's see. Then I visited Abdurrahman Odeh a couple of times. He is also in Beaumont, Port Arthur. He's in the medium security prison. And then Ibrahim Zain, who's the elder of the group, I visited him in California. He was in near LA in a prison there for a few years, and now he's just been moved again. I'm not sure where he is right now. They move them around all the time.
And how are they taking it? Some of them were put in solitary confinement. How are they taking their prison sentences?
You know, Ralph, these men had gone through every stage of hell that you can imagine. These are fine men who tried to make the most of every situation, you know. They are deeply, deeply religious, deeply, deeply spiritual men. I've never met more free, more determined, more healthy emotionally and spiritually men in my life. I mean, they're sitting there in the prison wearing these prison uniforms. They can't go to the bathroom without permission from a guard, you know? And they sit there and they're proud and they believe in what they did and they believe in the justice of their cause and they know that they're innocent and they are true believers. They believe that God has, you know, in Islam, there's this belief that God would not burden you with anything unless he had the faith that you can handle it, that you can carry the burden. So this is the burden that they were carrying. You know, they teach the other inmates, they participate, they lead prayers, they educate themselves, they read. I mean, these are very, very positive, incredibly positive people. And my biggest question was, how do they not lose their mind? I mean, suddenly they take you to solitary confinement with no explanation. Suddenly they take you and they move you to a prison. You don't know where you're going to go. I described one of the journeys they had on a prison bus for days on, and they had no idea where they were going. And they're shackled and they're handcuffed. And for them, only them, even though it's a bus full of, and then the plane full of prisoners, they were given a special kind of device called a black box, which limits it goes over the handcuffs and limits your movement. And they're sitting there like this for days on end, days and nights, I should say. And they just believe that they are, you know, God is with them and God is watching them and God has a plan for them. And it's incredible the things that they have endured and continue to endure and their families continue to endure. And they do this as really free men. I've never seen such free men in my life.
Well, just looking forward here, their appeals have been exhausted.
Yeah.
Unless there's new evidence of criminal behavior in the process of the prosecution, the cases are not likely to be reopened. We make a big deal, our government, about political prisoners in Russia and Turkey and Iran. Why aren't some foreign countries making a big deal of the political prisoners in our country? Let's start with the Palestinian Authority. Let's start with B'Tselem, the great human rights organization in Israel. Why aren't they calling for some sort of justice here?
Well, you know what's interesting? When I heard of this case initially, I thought of Sacco and Vanzetti, and I'm sure you know Sacco and Vanzetti,
Sure.
the two Italian immigrants that were wrongfully accused and executed. And I read about
that was in the late 1920s.
Right.
Hugely controversial. They were
Hugely
considered
controversial.
anarchists in Massachusetts, and
right.
many legal historians think they were railroaded into their capital punishment. Sacco Vanzetti.
Right. And then Governor Dukakis eventually pardoned them, 100 years later, and there's a statue somewhere when there were songs written about them. But when their trial was going on, there were massive protests in Shanghai, in Tokyo, in London, in Paris, in LA, all around the world to support these people. All around the world. Now, mind you, that people did not have telephones in those days, right? Let alone, cell phones and internet and all of this, right?
Yep.
The entire world stood up. And these guys, nothing, hardly any attention, hardly any protest. Now, the Palestinian Authority, B'Tselem, all these organizations, they're all fighting their own fights for survival too. I mean, the Israeli government just clamped down on the Palestinian National Fund because it provides stipends for the families of political prisoners held by Israel. And they're saying, well, these are not political prisoners, they're terrorists, and therefore they're using the same rationale, the same logic. They're saying, well, they are providing funds for terrorism, and therefore they have to be closed down.
And then the ditto head, Donald Trump, has just cut over $300 million contribution to UNRWA, the legendary relief group for Palestinians and other poor people in that area. And he's just sidelined over $200 million of congressional appropriations designed for Palestinian relief. Even Israeli government sources wondered about how advisable that was in terms of instability. Why aren't people around the world calling the U.S. government on this political prisoner situation?
Well, either they are afraid or they don't care because they're not white. I mean, the fact that these guys are not white, I think, is a big factor. If they were white, if they were not Muslims and Palestinians, none of this would have happened. They don't want to deal with terrorism. They don't want to deal with Palestinians. It's sticky. It's toxic. You touch this. I mean, there are people that, there are mosques in America that don't want to hear the story, that don't want me to come and talk about it because they're so afraid of this. And so it's the same thing people overseas. They don't want to anger the Americans. They certainly don't want to anger the Israelis because Israel's fingerprints are all over this case. The documents, the witnesses, the Anti-Defamation League started this whole witch hunt against these people. Chuck Schumer and Anthony Weiner and all these other Zionists were way early on behind bringing down this organization and these people. So people do not want to get embroiled in something that in the end might harm them and will lead to, and they don't believe it will lead to anything. I think that's why people are not involved.
How about B'Tselem? They're pretty fearless human rights group in Israel.
Yeah, but they deal with the issues in Israel, number one. And number two, they're under attack now by the Israeli government too, as being traitors and supporting terrorism. And I mean, these same claims of supporting terrorism to anyone who touches Palestine is not unique to the United States. It started in Israel. It's been emboldened now, I have to say, in other words, the Israeli government has been emboldened by what has happened here and its greatest success. In fact, the Shabak, the Israeli secret police, on their website had an article congratulating themselves for helping with the trial of the Holy Land Foundation 5. And so there's a sense that we're not going to touch any of this, number one, because it's toxic. Number two, everybody's fighting for their lives. Anybody who wants to speak for the Palestinians in any way, shape, or form is going to be somehow tainted and accused of supporting terrorism.
So outside of a presidential commutation or pardon, there's no hope for these 5 men the rest of their lives or the rest of their sentences.
Yeah, no, I don't think the sad thing is there isn't. And when they were petitioning Obama before he left, I visited several of them, and they asked me, "So what do you think? What do you think?" And I told them that I don't think Obama is going to commute the sentences of 5 Palestinians convicted of terrorism charges. It's not going to happen politically. It's just not feasible. And of course, he didn't.
This case sure reflects what happens when you have a breakdown of due process and you have a breakdown of the judicial process in American law. And what must have been like for you? You came over here and you settled in California, but you go back and forth to Israel and to Palestine. But I'm sure you came here thinking this is the land of the free, home of the brave. How did this case affect you? You immersed yourself for many months in this case.
I worked for almost 5 years on this case, and by the time I was working on this case, I was already I pretty much knew where I was, what America was about, and so I was skeptic enough. But I have to say that I was absolutely shocked in reading the transcripts of the trial, what the judges allowed to take place in a courtroom, the nonsense, the lies. It was the political nonsense, the ignorance on the side of the I don't know if it's ignorance or if it's just they don't care about the facts, but the ignorance that was displayed about the reality of Palestine, the reality in which Palestinians live, the lives of these men. And I have to say, at first I thought the defense team must have been, amateurs. They were not. They were brilliant. These are caring, serious attorneys who almost all of them said to me, they would give their right arm if they thought they could release any one of these guys, because these men were such good men. And they were not given a chance. And when I read the transcripts, that's why I read so many of them. I read over 20,000 pages. Because you have to read it to believe it. You absolutely have to read it to believe what went on in that courtroom. And the defense team just couldn't get a break.
Usually when there are cases like this, there are law review articles going into the details. Have there been any law review articles on this case?
Not to my knowledge.
Well, if there are any law students or law professors or members of the Lawyers Guild listening to this program, see if you can pick this case up and at least start documenting it in law reviews and maybe beginning to raise the public consciousness of this case. Unfortunately, we're out of time, Miko Peled. Thank you very much for coming on the show. Your book is Injustice, the Story of the Holy Land Foundation 5, published by Just World Books in Charlottesville, Virginia. Hats off to Just World Books. And I urge people who are concerned about travesty of justice in America to read this gripping book.
Thank you so much.
We've been speaking to Miko Peled, author of Injustice, the Story of the Holy Land Foundation 5. We will link to that at ralphnaderradiohour.com. When we come back, we're going to talk about an in-depth report that has just come out on Supreme Court hopeful Brett Kavanaugh, and another report on how when it comes to corporate crime, the Trump administration has a rather light touch. We're going to be doing that with the president of Public Citizen, Rob Weissman. Speaking of which, let's take a 1-minute break and check in with our corporate crime reporter, Russell Mokhiber. You are listening to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. Back after this.
From the National Press Building in Washington, D.C., this is your Corporate Crime Reporter Morning Minute for Friday, August 31, 2018. I'm Russell Mokhiber. A former snack food and corn syrup industries lobbyist appointed by the Trump administration to set food policy at the U.S. Department of Agriculture is in close contact with her former employers on major and wide-ranging nutrition policies. That's according to emails obtained by the Project on Government Oversight. Correspondence between 3 recent appointees and representatives from the industry organizations, including the Corn Refiners Association and the Snack Food Association, show lobbyists proposing names of potential members for a federal advisory committee on sodium, producing talking points for Secretary of Agriculture George Sonny Perdue, and seeking intelligence on agency policy decisions. Secretary Perdue seems to have installed an extra-large revolving door to usher in lobbyists and executives from giant corporations, said the Union of Concerned Scientists. For the Corporate Crime Reporter, I'm Russell Mokhiber.
Thank you, Russell. You know, Ralph, always characterized George W. Bush as a, quote, corporation disguised as a human being, unquote. I myself would take that a little farther with our current president and say that Donald Trump is a corporate crime disguised as a human being, a walking, talking, tweeting corporate crime. Our next guest is going to tell us about the light touch the man of the people, Donald Trump, has had on all the best people, his corporate cronies. Robert Weissman is a staunch public interest advocate and activist, as well as an expert on a wide variety of issues ranging from corporate accountability and government transparency to trade and globalization to economic and regulatory policy. As the president of Public Citizen, Weissman has spearheaded the effort to loosen the chokehold corporations and the wealthy have on our democracy. He has also been a strong voice in the fight against Wall Street greed and recklessness, and has expanded Public Citizen's work to curb climate change and push for single-payer Medicare for All healthcare system. Last month, they released a detailed report entitled Corporate Impunity, Tough on Crime, Trump is Weak on Corporate Crime. And just this week, they have released a scathing report on the judicial record of Supreme Court nominee Brett Kavanaugh. Welcome back to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, Rob Weissman.
Thanks for having me on.
Let's get right to it, Rob. This report that Public Citizen put out in conjunction with the corporate research project of Good Jobs First is called Corporate Impunity. The so-called tough on crime Trump is weak on corporate crime, wrongdoing, and enforcement. And I must say I was astonished, and I know a little bit about corporate crime. I was astonished by the figures. The total demolition of law and order dealing with the corporate crime wave in America under the Trump regime so far. But what astonished me was what the polling of the American people show who favor tough regulatory enforcement. Listen to this, listeners. If you don't believe there's a left-right support for cracking down on corporate crime, what do these polls show, Robert Weissman?
Well, no matter how you divide America, everyone supports stronger regulatory enforcement. So nationwide, it's about 87 to 12% people saying they support tougher regulatory enforcement. Once you hear that number, you know it's basically everyone's. But so Democrats are 89%, Republicans, though, are at 85%. Every part of the country, you're well over 80% against some tiny number who think, well, regulatory enforcement is working okay. And it's easy enough to understand why. People think the system is rigged. They're right. And they see it manifested in the most obvious way, which is corporate wrongdoers getting away with it, never being put in jail, not even being held accountable under the criminal law, as against all too many people's direct experience with the criminal justice system and friends and family being thrown in prison for trifling, nonviolent drug offenses.
Yeah, the amazing thing about it is getting away with it is the phrase on the minds of so many Americans. It's one reason why they come in about 90% to break up the big New York Wall Street banks, because they believe accurately that the banks got away with their wild speculation and crimes in 2007-8 and crashed the economy and unemployed millions of workers and trillions of dollars lost in pension and mutual funds, and then they went to Washington and got a bailout. So we have what should be an unstoppable political force. When you get over 85% and higher of the American people who want the law to crack down on these corporate crooks, and President Trump and his appointees are doing the opposite. I mean, they are, as you say in this report, which is 103 pages, we'll tell you how to get it in a moment. You say in this report, one regulator after another is making these amazing statements against their own oath of office, which they took to enforce the law. Do you want to give some examples?
Yeah, it is astounding. And what they're doing is basically saying, look, we exist here and the regulatory agencies to serve our customers. Well, you might think your customer is the American public, but you'd be wrong if you were in the Trump administration. What they mean by that is their job is to help the businesses they regulate. I think one of the most astounding ones is a low-profile one in the area of nursing homes, where they're engaged at the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, which is part of the government that oversees and regulates nursing homes. This is a very concerted effort to never fine nursing homes for abuse of their patients. Well, it turns out that over the last 4 or 5 years, 40% of the nursing homes in the country have been cited for a serious violation. So, like, it's happening all the time, and anyone who's had family in nursing homes knows it's happening all the time. The Trump administration effort, though, is one memo after another saying, stop fining. Try to help them do a better job, encourage them not to violate the law, but don't fine them. And that's one exemplary part of the government, but it's everywhere. And the comments from people who are in charge of agencies are just astounding because they think their job is to help their companies. The Secretary of Agriculture, Sonny Perdue, he says government should make things easier for our customers whenever possible. Again, that means agribusiness, not consumers. Ben Carson said that effective enforcement of the Fair Housing Act under President Obama was ridiculous. Elaine Chao at the Department of Transportation says, we don't believe that we or the government know best. She said this when she was talking to industry about regulations. We're partners with you instead. Mick Mulvaney, who's moonlighting as the current acting director of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, which he's trying to destroy, when he came in, he said he would no longer push the envelope when it comes to enforcement, that the agency is supposed to work for everyone, the people who get credit cards, but also the people who give out credit cards, the ones who were being, this is me now, not him, who are being predated on by payday lenders, but also the people who make the payday lenders. It's just astonishing.
Even worse, he was quoted as saying that one of the functions of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, which was enacted in order to police Wall Street, he said that one of the functions was to advocate for Wall Street. And then he makes this absurd comment, and he's a lawyer too, former congressman from South Carolina. He said the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau is ending, quote, regulation by enforcement, end quote. Now, when you have top government officials flouting congressionally enacted mandates to enforce the law, and they systematically, this isn't just prosecutorial discretion, they systematically are shutting down the federal cops on the corporate crime beat. What kind of remedy do public interest lawyers or groups like Public Citizen have?
Well, in fact, the remedies aren't great on this. It's the kind of thing, as you know, that goes massively underreported, so they're able to. There's not enough spotlight on it. So the spotlight can actually make a difference, and even the focus at the CFPB with Mulvaney has had a marginal impact. But in most cases, in the some of the environmental areas are separate. Where the government chooses not to prosecute a company for wrongdoing, there's not really much that citizens or citizen organizations can do. It's a little different in the environmental space, where under a number of statutes, affected parties, so a community that's affected, can sue the polluter, the perpetrator, directly, not just for being affected by having to breathe polluted air, but for the violation of the federal regulation. And that's really a model of what we need much more of, so that people can sue the wrongdoers directly when the government regulators choose to lie down on the job.
And when you scuttle law enforcement, you're not only reducing penalties and fines on corporate violators, but you have more people in America dying from occupational disease, air pollution, water pollution, contaminated food, unsafe cars. More people are injured. More people get diseases. More people's life savings are fleeced. We had an expert on the program a few months ago, Rob, who is a consultant to ARP and the FBI. He estimated $1 trillion of corporate ripoffs and just traditional scams, cheating, payday loan rackets, etc. $1 trillion a year. So we're talking about real impacts on the people of our country by the Trump regime. And give us an idea of the Secretary of Education. This whole student loan is up to $1.4 trillion. You have for-profit rapacious universities emerging from any enforcement process by Betsy DeVos, Secretary of Education. Give us a skim on that one.
Well, as you know, over the last 20 years or so, the for-profit predatory college industry has mushroomed out of control. And it's basically giving a community college level education for the better ones, but charging, Ivy League tuitions. And the question is, well, how are they able to pull this thing off? And the answer is they lure people in with deceptive marketing. Then they get the students, who are often veterans or older students, to get federal loan guarantees. So they're effectively drawing on money from the federal government that these people can never pay off. They can never pay off the loans because they're getting such a shoddy education that the jobs they're going to get after finishing, if they're able to finish, are not going to give them income to pay back the loans. And they've built a whole business model on this, which is both throwing these people ruthlessly into bankruptcy and saddling them with these debts that can last for decades when they're really trying to live the American dream, and simultaneously ripping off the American taxpayer, who's the one who's guaranteeing the loans in the first place. The Obama administration, to its credit, actually tried to do some decent stuff to crack down on this. Betsy DeVos has brought people in from the for-profit college industry to have the key positions in the Department of Education overseeing the for-profit college industry. She has tried to undo the two main rules that the Obama administration put in place to protect students from these rip-off colleges, and the result is going to be that $1.4 trillion figure you're referencing is going to get far, far worse until this thing is brought back under control. But it is completely a case of the industry in charge of the industry.
And the Department of Agriculture under Trump, they want to privatize, otherwise meaning corporatize, hog plant inspections. The kind of pork you get will be under the scheme, people working for corporations. There's got to be more legal remedies created so people in this country can challenge a rogue government that operates this way and turns our public trust into private profit. One thing about this report that is unique, you had a list of all the fines, comparing the fines under the last year of the Obama administration with the fines under the first year of the Trump administration. You want to give some indication overall and a couple examples?
Yeah, so this is the stunning bit. This is what we're talking about is not just impressions, and we weren't just collecting these outrageous quotes from agency leaders, although the collection of quotes themselves is pretty stunning. We were able to, and we spent a ton of time on this, compile the total amount of fines that different agencies levied under the last couple of years of the Obama administration, and then compare it to the first year of the Trump administration. And at almost every agency we looked at, the total amount of fines fell drastically. So at the Environmental Protection Agency, the total amount of fines fell by 94%. At the Department of Justice, which is, of course, the lead law enforcement agency in the country, the total amount of fines fell 90%. Those are the two worst examples, but they're representative of what happened basically every single agency under the Trump administration. And as you say, that's not an abstraction. It's not just a matter of taking money from these corporations. It's sending a message to corporations that they should just feel free to go ahead and violate the law. And when they violate the law, that's not just an abstract injustice. It's exactly what you said. It means poisoning people with unsafe air or dangerous food. It means stealing from them and getting away with it. It means selling them dangerous products that are going to injure and maim needlessly.
And how can people listening get a copy of this report? It's free. How can they get it?
The easy way to do is to go to corporatepresidency.org/enforcement, and there's a summary of it there, and you can click through to get the whole 101-page thing, but you get a very digestible version at corporatepresidency.org/enforcement.
Okay. You've just put out, Public Citizen, a pretty devastating report, very accurate report on the judicial record of Brett Kavanaugh, who's up for nomination before the Senate Judiciary Committee to become Associate Justice of the Supreme Court. Can you summarize that for people and then tell them how they can get that? Because their hearing is coming up fast by Chairman Grassley. He's rushing it, even though a huge amount of material has not been disclosed about Judge Kavanaugh in early September.
Well, the short version is that Judge Kavanaugh issues opinions that overwhelmingly favor business interests and against the public interest. The slightly longer version is what we did is instead of just looking at all of his decisions, we looked at his opinions in split decision cases. So he serves on an appeals court the norm is that the 3 judges hear the cases that are brought before them. So a lot of the cases are decided 3-0. Those often aren't really close call cases. But if you look at the 2-1 cases, you can see where there was some matter of controversy, and you get a better insight into what a judge's philosophy is by examining those cases. So we looked at all of the cases that were 2-1, where Judge Kavanaugh wrote a decision, or where the full en banc panel considered something and Judge Kavanaugh wrote a decision, but there was a division among the panel. That narrowed the universe to just over 100 cases, and when we looked at the business law cases, or the ones relating to consumer, environment, and worker rights, we found quite startling results. So in the area of consumer and regulatory issues, Judge Kavanaugh decided 18 times for business interests, 4 times for the public interest. For the environment, it was 11-2. For worker rights, both employment cases and union cases, it was 15-2 favoring employers, twice favoring employees. In cases brought by victims of police and human rights abuses, he decided against, or wrote opinions against the victims every single time, 7 out of 7. In the 2 significant antitrust cases in which he was involved, where there was a split decision, he came out very strongly for the merging parties and against the government in each of those cases. So in instance after instance, he sided with business and against the public interest. And also, when you look at the record, what you see is that it was the outcome that seems to matter more than the theory. So he's very big, writes very extensively about the issue of how much courts should defer to agencies, how much they should sort of give the agency the benefit of the doubt in a close call. And he's got an elaborate theory about it. But the answer is he gives the agency the benefit of the doubt when they favor the corporation. But when they're doing something that the corporations oppose, he gives them 0 deference.
You know, he seems to me to be a cruel, brutish, smiling, convivial judge, which is what Reagan taught us, how to be cruel with a smile and get away with it. But this guy is over the top. I have never seen a nomination for the Supreme Court, a lifetime position, essentially a judicial dictator, who is about to be confirmed unless the Democrats become much more energetic in the House and people around the country contact the Senate Judiciary Committee and demand lengthy hearings, multi-day hearings. Senate Judiciary Committee, he's going to get through. And he can be the 5-4 tip on the Supreme Court, and those 5 will become the lethal corkscrew twisting into the livelihoods, protections, and rights of the American people, and never mind liberal or conservative. Whether they're liberal or conservative, they're going to bleed under Judge Kavanaugh's pro-corporate prejudices. So what do you tell people out there to do in the next couple weeks?
Well, it's exactly as you say. I mean, the focus right now is on the Senate Judiciary Committee. This is going to become, who knows what Donald Trump's going to do, but it's more or less going to be the national spotlight issue for the early part of September. And the outcome is going to depend on whether or not the people speak up enough about it. I mean, particularly the people in the states with Republican senators who might be open to voting against him, Maine and Alaska especially. But there's going to have to be a lot more ferment if he's going to be knocked off his trajectory onto the court. And I got to tell you, having read these decisions, it is exactly what you said, and he's a great writer. He's very credentialed in the way that his advocates say, but he has extreme views.
Well, he was deeply involved in the Florida machinations during the 2000 election on behalf of the Republicans. He was deeply involved for several years in the Bush-Cheney regime and in the Starr investigation of Clinton. He has a huge paper record, which the Republicans are refusing, by and large, to disclose. Isn't that right?
Yeah, that's right. There's a process to review these, the records, especially from the time at the Bush White House, which are at the National Archives. The archives said, they're processing the materials. They have to look at it for various kinds of privacy and national security issues. It would take them to the end of October before they could get through the material. As you say, Chairman Grassley says too bad, we're not waiting. So instead, the material that's become available is being reviewed by a Republican lawyer who's producing tens of thousands of documents, most of which aren't very interesting, but out of something like 3 million pages that really ought to be reviewed and almost all of them released. And exactly as you say, like there are big questions. And Senator Leahy, who was chair of the Judiciary Committee at the time that Judge Kavanaugh was confirmed to be judge, he's more or less said that Judge Kavanaugh lied to them at the time about what his role was in the Bush White House. And the only way to get to the bottom of that, which is a very serious accusation from a senator who is not prone to extreme rhetoric, is to actually see the underlying documents. But Chairman Grassley is rushing this thing through to prevent that from happening.
But haven't the Democrats filed freedom of information cases?
Yeah, it's so extreme that they're saying they're seeking not just the normal disclosure, which would be normally done for Senate confirmation, but saying, we're using our formal legal rights under the Freedom of Information Act. The problem is that that's not likely to move fast enough to get the information out either.
As one of my law professors once told me, dictatorial procedures produce dictatorial results. How do people get a copy of this report quickly, and it's free?
At citizen.org.
And what do they ask for?
They'll see it right now is up on the main page of citizen.org on Judge Kavanaugh's record.
Get it, read it, send your comments to your members of the Senate from your state. It's not too late to stop 40 years or so of judicial corporate dictatorship in the name of Brett Kavanaugh. Thank you very much, Rob Weissman, President of Public Citizen.
Always great to be with you guys.
Well, that's our show. For those of you listening on the radio, we're going to check out now. For you podcast listeners, stay tuned for some bonus material we call the wrap-up. We're going to talk a little bit more to Rob Weissman about Kavanaugh and corporate impunity. For Ralph's weekly column, go to nata.org. For more from Russell Mokhiber, go to corporatecrimereporter.com. Visit the American Museum of Tort Law and go to tortmuseum.org and check out the Tort Museum bookstore for engrossing books and memorabilia. The producers of the Ralph Nader Radio Hour are Jimmy Lee Wirt and Matthew Marin. Our executive producer is Alan Minsky. Our theme music, Stand Up, Rise Up, was written and performed by Kemp Harris. And a transcript of this episode we will put up eventually at ralphnaderradiohour.com. Join us next week when we speak to Rosemary Gibson, author of China RX, about the dangers of drugs coming to us from China. Talk to you then, Ralph.
Thank you, everybody. Listeners, weigh in on the upcoming nomination hearings of Judge Brett Kavanaugh. Weigh in on your two senators.
Hi, this is Jimmy Lee Wirt, producer of the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. Welcome to the wrap-up, where we talk a little more to both of our guests, and Steve and Ralph have a short discussion about the Catholic Church's problem with pedophile priests. First up, Ralph goes through what experts had to say about Miko Peled's book Injustice, and then asks his favorite question.
Just so you know, listeners, this meticulous investigation by Miko Peled, called Injustice, of what's happened to the Holy Land Foundation 5, as they're called, has been described as such by some very prominent people. Professor Jonathan Turley of George Washington University Law School, for one, Marjorie Cohen, a professor emerita at the Thomas Jefferson School of Law, called the fate of the Holy Land Five, quote, a grave miscarriage of justice against the Holy Land Five, capitalizing on post-9/11 Islamophobia hysteria. The U.S. government used secret evidence, conflating charity with terrorism, to convict 5 Palestinian men of providing material support for terrorism. And Michael Deutsch, a human rights lawyer and co-author of Secrets and Lies, The Persecution of Muhammad Salah, called the prosecution one of the great judicial injustices in the, quote, war on terrorism, end quote, of which there have been many, in a prosecution infused with the often deadly prejudice of Islamophobia. And then there's the prominent law professor at University of South Carolina, Wedi Said, who wrote his own book, a highly regarded book called Crimes of Terror, the Legal and Political Implications of Federal Terrorism Prosecutions, said, additionally, Peled shows the sheer negative impact that alleging terrorist links can have on the law, twisting basic principles of due process and constitutional protection beyond recognition, end quote. Well, you're a leading human rights advocate, especially for the Palestinian cause. You were the son of a famous Israeli general. You've written the book General's Son. And were you invited after this book, Injustice, came out earlier this year to go on, number one, Democracy Now!, Amy Goodman?
No, I've not spoken to Amy Goodman about this book at all. No,
okay. How about NPR?
Nope.
Yeah, they have a lot of puzzles programs. They've got all kinds of entertainment programs, but something like this they didn't want to touch. How about PBS, Public Broadcast System?
No.
How about any other talk show host, commercial or nonprofit?
No, nothing major. No, I've not been on any major program. I've not been interviewed by any major of the big names that are out there. People do not want to piss off the government. They do not want to piss off Israel. They do not want to touch on this issue of terrorism. So I think people are either afraid or indifferent, or both.
Now here, Ralph and Rob Weissman talk about one area where corporate fines in the Trump era have actually gone up.
To be fair to Trump, there's one reverse figure here. The Office of Foreign Assets Control under Obama imposed $22 million in fines, and Trump, in his first year, imposed $124 million in fines. What's that about?
Well, of course, this is just trivial in dollar amounts compared to what we were just discussing, these $50 billion reductions at the Department of Justice and so on. This is an office that focuses primarily on companies that are illegally doing business with designated enemy countries. And apparently the penalties have gone up in year one of the Trump administration. But again, that's a total of just over $100 million versus the $45 billion with a B drop we were talking about at the Department of Justice and the Environmental Protection Agency.
Okay, this report, Corporate Impunity, came out over a month ago. What kind of coverage did you get in the independent press, the NPR, PBS media, and the commercial press?
We didn't get nearly the coverage that we had hoped for. I think it's going to have a long life. It was actually just mentioned in the New York Times and the Washington Post over this past weekend, and separately in two independent stories. But it wasn't front page news at the time it came out. In fact, it wasn't covered at the time it came out in either one of those publications. The main story was from the Associated Press, which got a lot of pickup around the country, but it wasn't amplified in the major media, and it didn't get much, if any, attention in TV and broadcast.
So nothing on NPR or PBS?
No. And this was a story, it's a story with numbers, so in some sense they like to pull away from that. But we also gave them example after example to try to, give them concrete stories that they could report that would put personal stories on top of the devastating data that we had compiled.
And here, Steve gets to ask Rob a couple of questions.
So the first question is about Kavanaugh. Now, you yourself just said that he is credentialed and elections have consequences, and this is who the president wants. Isn't that what the other side's argument is going to be, and why are they wrong?
Well, in this case, there's the obvious fact that they held up the nomination of Merrick Garland. So that's not the set of rules that they feel like they need to play by. But beyond that, there has to be some evaluation of the merits of a nominee. And it's not just whether you got good grades in law school and are a good writer. I mean, it matters whether a justice on the Supreme Court cares about justice for the American people. I mean, that has to be at least a component of what the Senate is considering when they make a decision to confirm or not confirm a nominee. And I think that when you actually read Judge Kavanaugh's opinions, you see someone who has really extreme views. And I think, and is what we tried to show in this report, he's inconsistent in how he applies his grand theory to come out the way corporations want. It's one thing if you say, look, I'm always deferential or I'm never deferential to agencies, but when you invoke that only when it's convenient, that's an even bigger problem.
Now, I assume you'll be getting this report to Democrats on the Judiciary Committee. Is there anyone you think who will be able to make these arguments in an effective way?
Well, we're definitely sharing it with all the committee Democrats. We'll share it with all the Republicans, too. I hope that it's raised. I think a number of them are going to try to raise this stuff. the hearings themselves, in part because of what Ralph said, which is that they're too short. I mean, it forces the senators into kind of a, you could generously say, a sort of strategic gamesmanship about how they handle themselves during the hearing, but it becomes a kind of performance art and less an actual interrogation of the nominee's record. So I think the things that we're presenting are really useful, and we'll see how they're deployed by the senators. I mean, I think the Judiciary Committee has a lot of tough Democrats on it. I mean, that's not good enough if the Republicans aren't open to being persuaded. But I think we'll see some strong questioning, but they're going to be very constrained, if for no other reason than the harsh time limits that Senator Grassley is going to impose on them.
And finally, Ralph and Steve have a conversation about a hot item in the news.
Now, Ralph, you wanted to say a word or two about what's going on at the Vatican with the pedophile issue.
Well, this multi-year exposure of pedophile behavior by some Catholic priests started in Boston with a lawsuit under the tort of law. If it wasn't for the law of torts, all this would not have been exposed at the beginning. So I think it's important for us to respect the function of the law of torts, not allow the insurance industry to so degrade and caricature it. The second thing that occurs to me is many Catholics have said that the level of pedophile behavior is related to the celibacy requirement imposed on Catholic priests, and that if that was lifted, there wouldn't be that degree of molestation. What do you think about that, Steve?
Well, I agree, and I think most people don't realize that the celibacy requirement only dates to the Middle Ages. It was, I believe, and I'm not an expert on this, a form of control, of paternal control, male control over the power of the church. And that's the reason it exists. It was not something that the early Christians or the early Catholics actually practiced. So it only dates back to that. And what's interesting to me is now there are reactionary elements within the Vatican who are attacking Pope Francis for his, and let's face it, everybody is culpable in this for covering it up or for not doing enough to stop it. And Francis is no exception. But apparently the former Secretary of State or the current Secretary of State of the Vatican has used this as an opportunity to attack Pope Francis, who he doesn't like for his pastoral approach to the papacy, which is different than what has been happening, with popes in the last few hundred years.
And his more liberal views on homosexuality.
Yes, they see that as a threat to, gay marriage and abortion and things like that they're afraid on these kinds of issues. That Francis is going against the doctrine. And the truth of the matter is, you see this in Ireland and it's in America too. They are just completely out of step with the vast majority of Catholics, people who still go to church. They go to church for the community. They are still faithful to their cultural roots in Catholicism. But, the polling shows that most of these Catholics in America and Ireland, and I'm sure in other places around the world, are far more liberal. It's like we talk about in politics, far more liberal than the powers that be.
Well, thank you for those comments. I know you're born a Catholic and you're reflecting a more rational view of how to deal with this situation, which is horrific. And I was told years ago by the lawyer who brought the case in Boston, it was just the tip of the iceberg, and we've certainly seen that that's the case.
Yeah, it's sad. It used to be, and of course, whenever anybody has absolute power, we know that can go to a dark place, and that's what priests had. And priests in the time, let's say in America, let's just say in the early part of the 20th century, from these Catholic immigrant families, being a priest was a real, put you in high status. That meant you had education. And so I think you were getting really sort of a better person who was becoming a priest. And in these last few generations, I think the priesthood, and I think it has a lot to do with the celibacy requirement, they're not getting the best people. They're getting the oddballs. They're getting the, people who otherwise don't fit. And I'm not saying that's everybody, but I'm saying they're not drawing from this. It doesn't have the same status it had when it was this early 20th century immigrant family way of having your firstborn son become a priest, because then they would have education.
And that's a wrap.
Stand up, you've been sitting way